Well, yesterday, the film No Other Land, the documentary, the
Yeah.
Israeli-Palestinian documentary, won Best Documentary at the Oscars. And as the New York Times reported, this is a film that received no U.S. distribution rights. No major streaming platforms picked up the film, no major distributor. It is shown at some small independent theaters that kind of individually took it up, but there's no major distribution. And that's unlike all the other Oscar winners. And according to the New York Times, this is typical for topical, controversial documentaries. But you look into the recent history of political documentaries, whether they're about labor rights or even gender issues, or the war in Ukraine, or Russia, the last two winners of the Oscar for Best Documentary related to Russia. These are all films that had major distribution that Netflix or Amazon and the major streamers picked up. It seems to be a pattern that's applied to any film that is critical of Israeli human rights, of the Israeli treatment of Palestinians. We've seen over a dozen films struggle to obtain distributors in the U.S., or even some films have been kicked off of Netflix, and those licenses have not been renewed, thanks to a very concerted, very organized pro-Israel pressure campaign. That if you stream these films, if you show them in the U.S., you're going to be pressured or attacked by these interest groups. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this because it's not necessarily, it's possible that there's a government role in this. It's not clear if there is any. It's simply kind of the censor of a third party using intimidation, using criticism, and it's effectively blocking American audiences from viewing these films. I think that might change for No Other Land after this accolade in Hollywood. But for the most part, we've seen many films fail to obtain distribution. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this dynamic.
Sure. I mean, so I always say there are like two components to there's censorship, like actual government censorship, or even, censorship not necessarily from government, but universities. And then there's cancel culture, which is different. And I think in many ways, cancel culture is a little bit more insidious. It means it loses you might lose your job if you say certain things. It's not allowing people to hear the perspectives of Palestinians. That's pressure campaigns in these types of situations to silence one set of voices. And it works, it's very effective. I think that Americans have kind of unequivocally, for the most part, supported Israel for many decades because they haven't heard the Palestinian perspective at all. We hear constantly about the Israelis' perspective, about the historical suffering of the Jews, which of course I don't want to downplay. But we don't hear this other side. Someone asked me really early on in COVID why I was skeptical of the propaganda around it, and I said, and it's true, that I had been attuned to the fact that the U.S. media is very good at propagandizing people because I was aware of what happened around the Palestine issue. My father's from the West Bank, and so I grew up hearing his stories and just very, very aware of how one-sided the view that Americans heard is. And there's a very good reason for this. I think that if Americans knew the horrendous conditions that Palestinians suffered in the occupied territories and and in Gaza, they would not support it. They wouldn't be okay with it. I mean, just the occupation, the oppression, imprisonment without charges, killing children, constantly strangling the economy, just overt racism, the lack of equal rights, more so in Gaza and the West Bank versus Israel than like Palestinians who live in Israel. That's always twisted, but that's another thing. But I think the fact that the film couldn't find a distributor here is very indicative of this issue, and it's just been so successful, and you're also deemed anti-Semitic if you say that because you're sort of saying there's this Jewish cabal that's making sure these voices can't be heard, and that's not what I'm saying, but there clearly are orchestrated efforts to silence Palestinians' voices.
No, that's right. And, I think that it really also brings attention to what's been happening in the West Bank. I think Americans generally do not pay attention to the Israel-Palestine conflict, even though they see these figures of billions of dollars in foreign aid and military aid going to Israel. They see kind of these episodic eruptions in violence. They don't pay attention to the day-to-day, particularly in the West Bank. And there's this kind of dichotomy between Gaza and the West Bank where people conflate the two issues. They say, okay, well, Hamas engaged in October 7th, so of course there's going to be repercussions on the Palestinian people, whether you agree or not. That's perhaps the mindset for a lot of Americans. Many do not realize that Hamas is not in control of the West Bank, that the repression in the West Bank has been ongoing well before October 7th. And in seeming retribution for October 7th, the repression has increased in the West Bank over the last year and a half. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and about your family's roots in the West Bank.
Sure. Yeah, so my dad grew up there. He's from a village near Jenin. It's actually closer to Nablus, but I think like Nablus didn't make for as good a girl's name as Jenin. So he named me after Jenin. But he was from a very small village. It was actually founded by his grandfather. Everyone who lived in the village was a very close blood relation. He grew up very, very poor. And he was about 15 when the West Bank fell under Israeli occupation. It had been Jordanian occupation. He said actually at first it was relatively benevolent and there were more economic opportunities. So they were happy. They didn't hate Israel because they were Jewish. They actually preferred it. But then there were some violent attacks against Jewish people, and that resulted in more crackdowns and increasing security measures in the occupied West Bank. So increasing oppression. And what this means in the daily life of Palestinians, which I could go on about forever, but I mean, you have no rights whatsoever. So you can be killed by an Israeli soldier and probably the soldier won't suffer any consequences or very minimal. You can be imprisoned without charges for indefinitely. Your property can be taken, and it is all the time. You can't travel easily. You have to go through checkpoints. That's a huge part. A lot of people, to get to work or to visit family or to travel at all, they have to go through these checkpoints where they have to wait for many hours. They can be searched, they can be strip searched, they can be killed, their property can be taken. It's extremely humiliating. And they just don't have any rights whatsoever. So the life under the occupation is really brutal. And my dad came to the United States for that reason. That was one reason he pursued an education, so that he could come here. And this has been going on since 1967 in the West Bank. Before that, Palestinians in Israel proper were dispossessed, but that's kind of another story. So most Americans don't know about this. Another issue is that typically very religious Jewish settlers have been coming in and taking the land. Actually, half of our family's land was taken for an Israeli settlement a couple decades ago. You can point to the settlement and see it on the other mountain. So they just take the land and there's nothing you can do about it. And the Israeli government doesn't do anything about it. It's a brutal situation.
Yeah, and it seems like the repression has just been increasing. One thing that I struggle with, I'm kind of just as a journalist, as a spectator, as someone who's interested in these issues, is that I'm hoping for a positive outcome. I want people to live in peace and to see each other's common humanity. And one problem I see on both the right and the left is just incredibly dehumanizing rhetoric. Yeah. You see this on the activist left, sometimes on college campuses and in the streets of these demonstrations, where they kind of attempt to delegitimize all of Israel or claim that rather than a Jewish project, this resembles white supremacy, which is simply inaccurate. You see some calls for violence, but really just kind of an angry disposition that I don't think it helps resolve the issue. I mean, at the end of the day, you have neighbors living alongside each other in the West Bank and other parts of Israel that they just need to get along. They need equal rights. And a rhetoric that kind of separates the two does not kind of get us onto that path. And I'm interested in kind of the horseshoe theory of some of the critics of the film No Other Land, because I've seen pro-Israel voices that are associated with the right or associated with the Israeli government say, this is a disgusting film that's anti-Semitic. I'm totally erasing the fact that there were several Israeli filmmakers and an Israeli journalist who helped create this film. And on the American left, some on the far left saying, why are these are collaborators working with the occupiers? Why is it an Israeli filmmaker working with a Palestinian? It's kind of the same argument, but from different sides of the spectrum. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's an opportune moment because I spent the morning arguing on Twitter with some of the extreme pro-Palestine people who were criticizing especially Yuval Abraham, who was the main Israeli director, and saying, he had spoken at his speech, he had said something about October 7th and how Hamas had acted horribly, which it had, because targeting of civilians is always wrong, and we should all agree on that. And there, like this novelist, for example, Susan Abdelwala, who I think is from the Jenin area, she wrote something like, this wasn't Yuval's film. This is all just, he's like, I forgot what the term was, but he's just part of the colonial project. This was Basel. Basel was the Palestinian. This was really Basel's film. Congrats to Basel. And Yuval was welcomed by Basel's family, but he deserves no credit. And I'm just like, what is this? This is so cruel and nasty and petty. How are we? I mean, we have to work together. The people who want peace on both sides of this have to come together and find their common humanity. I don't think that's like a silly, naive point of view. Why are we going to, you either just keep killing each other, which is what's happening now, or we start to find ways to work together and live in peace. And I thought also just being angry about the film getting recognition at the Oscars, or complaining about it for this reason, because Yuval was part of it, I think is also silly. I mean, it's a huge moment for Palestinian suffering to get 2 or 3 or 4 moments at the Oscars of airtime. This is how fringe, quote unquote, fringe ideas become mainstream, is through these kind of cultural institutions. And I think Conan O'Brien said a billion people were watching, maybe 1 billion people heard about this, a lot of whom probably know nothing about the Palestinian side of the story. That's huge. So, I mean, I was kind of frustrated with these people. And I think it's actually very unhelpful. Like, it turns people off. It makes the Palestinians look like extremists. It makes them look like they're not willing to work with other people. So, I mean, right now, there are babies being starved to death in Gaza. Like, let's stop that. That's what needs to stop.
Yeah, it reflects perhaps a pathology on the left that is maybe motivated by some type of anti-authoritarian vibe, but it actually, in effect, it is self-ostracizing. They prefer to be an underground movement. They prefer to be on the fringes. So when their causes gain mainstream recognition, they almost act with disgust, because anything mainstream or corporate is seen as an anathema to them. So it's a very unhelpful dynamic, because it really distances the actual cause of helping Israelis and Palestinians find common ground and end this conflict. If you have activists that just are reflexive in terms of hating any type of mainstream coverage or recognition.
Yeah, I mean, and that's pure, like, the reality of the situation is that most of the people we have in Congress don't even see Palestinians as human. I mean, they've sneered at the idea of their suffering for 16 months. When there were reports, I'm sure you know about, 65 healthcare workers in Gaza said that they were seeing a pattern of children shot in the head, which made it clear that IDF soldiers were targeting children and purposely executing them, which is really shocking. And it contradicts Israel's claim that any civilian deaths are accidental. You can also see from the mass carnage they're not accidental, but I think this really drives it home. So those 65 healthcare workers testified in Congress, and not a single senator showed up, not one. They couldn't be bothered. If this was testimony about Israeli children being shot in the head by Hamas, you can bet every single senator would be there. So, I mean, the dehumanization of Palestinians is so extreme, and they're being killed right now. And right now, Benjamin Netanyahu just said that he was closing the border so that no aid would be let into Gaza. This means this is going to harm lots of people who need food and medical care and other supplies. This is a moral emergency, not just a moral emergency. This is an emergency, and this needs to stop now. And being, nitpicky because this isn't exactly how you think, how the film, you would have wanted the film to just be Palestinian directors. Okay, let's argue about that in 10 years, but not right now.
No, I think that's right.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.